as I started doing more research into chronic stress and burnout specifically, I saw myself. I realized, wow, I've actually experienced burnout without realizing it twice in my lifetime. And then I got to thinking about how women of color, although we're more likely to experience burnout, we are, statistically speaking, half as likely to seek support.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented.
Where are you from? Really? No, originally, where are you from? Can I touch your hair? Your English sounds so good. Nah, I don't see color. Those statements I've shared are just some of the daily microaggressions that people of color face on a regular basis when they occupy white spaces. Microaggressions are subtle yet negative racial messages that leave the person on the receiving end feeling hurt, humiliated, and even disrespected. You may have used these kinds of statements to start a conversation or even break ice with a person of color, but didn't realize the harm you were causing. That's why I've created a free microaggressions guide with 5 of the commonly made microaggressions in online coaching spaces that you need to know about and what you can do or say instead. Head over to anikishuru.com/micro to download your free guide. That's anikishuru, GICHURU.com/micro, MICRO. Hey there, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Represented Podcast with me, Aniki Shuru. And today I'm bringing you one of my good friends. Her name is Jolinda Johnson, all the way from Barcelona, Spain. And she is such an expert when it comes to matters to do with burnout, talking about resilience, perimenopause, and the impact this has on women of color in particular, but also how you yourself as a coach can be a better space holder when you are navigating issues with your clients or even with yourself to do with burnout and how to be more resilient. So Jolinda Johnson is an award-winning certified life coach and holistic health coach who specializes in burnout and resilience. She's obsessed with helping changemakers and revolutionaries get their spark back so they can go set the world on fire. I love that. She wants to change the conversation around burnout and give attention to the voices that are typically left out of the conversation, including Black, Indigenous people of color, and the LGBTQIA+ community. She is the author of Resilience, 10 Ways to Recover from Burnout and Exhaustion. She is also taken to the stage as a motivational speaker for other life coaches and can be found on popular websites such as Healthline, Brains, and Yahoo Finance. Jolinda is originally from Detroit, Michigan, and for the last 15 years, she's made her home in Barcelona, Spain. Have a listen. You are going to love Jolinda. I am so excited to have you. Welcome.
I'm so excited to be here, Annie. Thank you for having me.
What actually got me thinking, what planted the seed of getting in touch with you and asking you to come on to do this was when you shared a post about microaggressions and the relationship between microaggressions and burnout. And I do want us to dive into that because the theme of March for me has been very much about educating my community about microaggressions. So we will be diving into that. But before we get into that, I really just want to talk about your career as a coach. You're an award-winning coach. And things have evolved over the years to getting you to where you are today. But I kind of want us to rewind and just briefly tell us, how did you land at the niche that you currently are in? And I know we've had conversations about, oh, should the focus be this? Or what about this? And I feel like my heart is being called to this. But if you could just talk us through that journey from a niche perspective, I'd really love to hear.
Well, how did I land on this particular niche of currently burnout, resilience, and perimenopause is through, let's call it trial and error, hands-on experience, and trusting my calling. Because I started out as a fertility coach and I was very successful in helping my clients get pregnant, and I enjoyed that work. But I am a deeply intuitive soul, and even when something is working well on the surface, if I have a deeper, let's call it an itch or a niggle that is saying there's more that you need to reveal, there's more that you need to explore, then I follow that. And I actually came upon burnout kind of by accident. I didn't go out looking for it. It definitely found me, because after I stopped focusing specifically on fertility and I broadened to women's health in general, all of my clients who were high achieving women in their, well, let's say between 35 and 55, were all coming to me with a similar set of symptoms, and they were all related to stress. And I thought, okay, if all of these women who are high performers like myself are coming to me with interrupted sleep and digestive issues and irregular or painful or non-existent periods, and either infertility or subfertility, maybe I should be taking a closer look at that. As I started doing more research into chronic stress and burnout specifically, I saw myself. And I realized, wow, I've actually experienced burnout without realizing it twice in my lifetime. And then I got to thinking about how women of color, although we're more likely to experience burnout, we are, statistically speaking, half as likely to seek support. And just like in perimenopause, we're also less likely to take up the spotlight when it comes to burnout. In other words, when I thought of who typically experiences burnout 5 years ago, I wasn't thinking of a woman of color in her 40s. I was thinking of white, white professional, probably in their early 30s.
And why is that? Why is that back then that's how you were thinking, and now that has shifted?
Honestly, it's through very targeted research that opinion has shifted, and that's what frightens me, because it's, I don't know if you or if it even got to Australia, but there was a Black female professor who recently committed suicide.
I saw that on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Yes. And I did a Google search, Black women bullying academia. And all of these articles came up about how bullying, microaggressions, code switching, all of these things are rampant in academia in the United States and in the UK. But these are things that if you're not looking for them, you you know, and I'm a highly educated Black woman as well, you know, this wasn't even on my radar. So I think that, you know, certain images are shared over and over in mass media, and certain stories are shared over and over in mass media. And so if you don't see yourself in those stories or in those images, you think, well, okay, maybe it just doesn't apply to me. You know, and it's very similar. You know, one of the reasons why I focus on burnout and perimenopause is because the symptoms of perimenopause are exacerbated as a result of chronic stress. And if you look at who experiences the worst symptoms of perimenopause, you know, the years leading up to your final period, the worst symptoms with earlier onset, greater frequency, more severity, it's women of color. And that, you know, but who do we see? Or it's just now changing, like in the last couple of years. But who do we typically see? A white woman in her 50s.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love that we're having this conversation, and I feel like it's taken a different tangent, which is absolutely great because this is this is organic, this is authentic to where things are at and what you're dealing with and experiencing. But what you said in terms of this is research that you've done and arrived at that conclusion in the US, in the UK. I also think it's in a lot more other areas in the world. It's just that it's not.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
It's just that it's not documented. So it's not to say that we're
Mm-hmm.
not experiencing that here in Australia. I bet you if I was to gather a group of Black women and women of color in corporate Australia and ask them about,
Yes, for sure.
the aspects of, their treatment in the workplace and rising up the corporate ladder and some of the barriers and the challenges that they face, I think a lot of people have stories that are very, very similar. It's just that it's not spoken about. Like we were speaking last night, and you were saying some of these things are hidden in plain sight, like they're
plain sight,
in plain sight. And I think for us, our culture here, Jolinda, in Australia, is that it's very covert. We don't talk about matters to do with issues to do with race openly, or calling people of color, or Black and white. It is such a covert culture where it's so taboo. You can't talk about these things openly. And in fact, very recently, I don't know if you've seen this in the news, we've had a huge public figure who's an athlete. She's a footballer. Her name is Sam Kerr, who has been accused of reverse racism, of being racist. She is of Indian descent, and she's a captain of the Matildas, which is, a soccer team which did really, really well at the Women Football World Cup. And so she apparently made this statement to a white policeman in the UK. It's taken them lots and lots of months to pin what would be what she's been accused of, and for this to be charged, for a charge to be made against her. And a lot of people have rallied behind and said, no, reverse racism doesn't exist. And, there are some structures that need to be in place. But the fact that the word white was used, and that word white was used by somebody who is not white, now has kind of brought this issue. And so I think when it comes to matters to do with race, we are kind of tiptoeing here in Australia. To bring it back to what you're saying, women of color, and I know there are a number of women of color who listen to this podcast, and perhaps some of the things that you're saying, they're just light bulb moments are going off and going like, I didn't realize that there was even a relationship between perimenopause and burnout and the stress that I'm experiencing in the workplace, and how all of that is intertwined. I want to change gears and talk about resilience, because a lot of the things that you do, Jolinda, resilience is at the core of teach and how you support your clients. I was wondering, why resilience? Why not courage? And not to say that courage should be the word, but I'm just wondering, from the work that you've done, why the term resilience and not courage?
Well, I think that courage contributes to resilience, but resilience for me is choosing to rise again and yet again. I think of the Maya Angelou poem, love one more time and always one more time. And for me, that's what resilience is. And I have Maya Angelou, the last three lines of I rise, I rise, tattooed on my arm to remind myself that, there are going to be a lot of circumstances that are beyond my control, especially as a mixed Black bisexual woman, also an immigrant who has lived out of the United States for the last 15 years until very, very recently, a single mother as well. And when you find yourself at the intersection of all of those things, differently abled, I have a lot of things going on that on any given day might make me feel like, too much, what's the point of fighting? But I think that's the thing with resilience, is that some people see it as a negative word, because if you have to be resilient, that means that there's something that you have to struggle against. And there are a lot of things that I do have to rise against that are not of my choosing. And I think that when we talk about what creates, states of chronic stress, racism is a state of chronic stress, ableism is a state of chronic stress, sexism is a state of chronic stress. And we know this by the research, how these things manifest in the physical body as well. So resilience for me is about choosing to rise above the circumstances and recognizing that you can trust yourself. It's possible to reconnect the body and the mind and reclaim your space and reclaim your rest and pursue your purpose with pride and the courage that you reference, and continue to be your most authentic self in the world, no matter how many times you're pushed down. It's just like, no matter how many times I'm pushed down, I still can't, maybe it comes from my parents because they're the same, but I refuse to accept that I can't get up again. As long as I'm alive, I have to keep trying.
I really, really love how you have defined resilience and the examples that you've used and the different identities and intersecting identities that you hold, and why resilience over courage, even though courage contributes to resilience. I love that description. You've gone on to share your 5-step resilience blueprint, where you say stress is inevitable, but burnout is avoidable. What are the
burnout is optional?
Yes. And so what are the
Yes.
telltale signs of burnout, and how can we avoid it? And I'm asking this for myself as well, because in 2023, I got to experience burnout and I didn't recognize it. I didn't see it when it started happening, but my body slowly began to shut down. It just forced me to completely stop. The speed at which I had been traveling with mentally, physically, I just couldn't keep up since I started my business. And I just couldn't do the things that were simple, to come sit here, hold master classes that I was known for, and holding several. I just didn't have the juice anymore, and just being sick, being in bed lots. And so I just wanted to know, because a lot of people I have heard speak say that burnout kind of creeps up on them. They don't even realize until they're
absolutely. Yes. Well, burnout has 4 stages, and a lot of us don't start paying attention until stage 3. And by stage 4, I mean, we really have no choice. One of the problems with burnout is that the symptoms in stage 1 are basically accepted as part of adult life, especially if you are a high achiever. And so many of us as women of color are. Something that I've noticed in speaking to clients, friends, and just, other business owners who are women of color, we really do take for granted that what we think of as normal is a level that some people never even get to in terms of pushing themselves. And we just think that that's what you have to do. And so it's the going to bed wired but tired, and so giving a quick summary of the early symptoms. It was basically what's happening in the initial stages of the stress response, and we need stress. Stress serves a purpose in the body. Acute stress serves a purpose. Not all stress is bad. It's the chronic stress that's the issue. So, initially you're going through this really intense time and the adrenaline kicks in. And I think a lot of us are familiar with that feeling of like, okay, I've got this big goal, I've got this big vision, and I'm revved up. I'm just going to say yes to everything because I know what's required of me, and I'm well resourced, and I've got all the skills, I've got all the tools. Let's go for it.
Yeah.
And throughout the day, you're feeling like, not anxious necessarily, but definitely like, revved. But then when night comes, when you're supposed to start winding down, you can't. You feel like your mind's still going 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And, you think, well, that's okay. I guess it's just, I'm energized, so I'll just stay up a little later, especially if you work for yourself. We're not supposed to be on our screens after 10 p.m., says the woman who's doing a podcast interview at midnight her time. But this is an exception. I haven't done this in years. But we're not supposed to be on our screens after a certain time. And a telltale sign that you are in, a stress response is when you get a burst of energy at the end of the day instead of the natural lull that's supposed to happen. So cortisol, which is our main stress hormone, and melatonin, which a lot of us have heard about in relationship to sleep, they have an inverse relationship. So when your cortisol is high, your melatonin is going to be low. That's why when we get up in the morning, we get a burst of cortisol, the cortisol awakening response, and we feel like, yes, that's the natural thing. I'm ready to take on the day. And, if you feel that way without coffee, then your adrenal glands are in good shape. And so at the end of the day, we're supposed to have low cortisol and high melatonin so that we can have a restful night's sleep. Another thing that the telltale sign is when you find yourself reaching for the band-aids. The sugar cravings will be higher. Alcohol cravings for a lot of us go up because we need to relax. If you are a smoker, that's another one that people will reach for. And these are all things that are just kind of, depending on where you live, very acceptable ways of coping.
Yes. You don't think twice about it when you're pouring that glass of wine. You're just like, it's just normal. Yes. Or reaching.
Yes, and it's a reward. Well, I worked so hard today, so I might as well have a glass of wine, even though alcohol contributes to poor sleep. Even though it can make you feel drowsy, it actually interrupts your deeper sleep cycles and anxiety. Specifically for women, another thing that you'll notice is more symptoms of PMS. So greater irritability, more painful cramps, heavier flow, more bloating. That's another telltale sign that hormones are not exactly happy. Because what happens when in the acute stress response, everything that doesn't have to do with running away or towards danger, depending on if you're going to, into fight or flight mode. Anything that doesn't have to do with survival is deprioritized, survival in that moment. So reproductive functions deprioritized, digestive functions deprioritized. And over the long term, that's what happens. That's why we see worse fertility over time. That's why we see worse gut health over time, because your body is basically throwing everything towards the production of stress hormones. Blood sugar, it gets completely dysregulated. Thyroid health. So a lot of times women don't even realize that they need to make major changes until they get a medical diagnosis. And that medical diagnosis isn't necessarily burnout. It can also be an autoimmune disease because of the chronic stress, like Hashimoto's hypothyroiditis.
Yeah, I feel like we've opened a can of worms here. Like we've just opened, and there's just so much to dive into. And I think one of the things that when we do realize that we do need help and we go see a medical professional, the issue is that sometimes we can get misdiagnosed where you could be
Yeah.
experiencing perimenopause, but you've gone to see a doctor
Yeah.
and they have ruled that's not even part of something that they're thinking about. So
Yeah.
also there are things that in the medical field, when you're being measured against a different criteria that doesn't take who you are and your identity into perspective,
Yes.
that's not what has been
Yes.
studied against, and that's not what has been used as a way to treat people who identify in this way. Because of course, as women of color,
Yes.
we have things that we experience maybe when we're younger that others with different
Yes.
races experience maybe much later or don't at all. There are certain
Yes.
races that are more predisposed to certain illnesses and diseases and symptoms.
Yes.
And so when we do get to that point where we realize, hang on, something is wrong with me, I don't feel right. How do we possibly begin to navigate that?
I think the first step is being honest with yourself, recognizing that the habits that you're engaging in, more than that, the circumstances, that are surrounding you. The first step is getting honest with the circumstances, because so many of us go into what's called thinking brain override, and we devalue the circumstances and we shame ourselves. So in other words, it's not that it's challenging to be in a competitive workplace where I'm constantly under scrutiny and being invalidated for my opinions while taking care of an elderly parent and my two children at home, and also finishing my second degree or doing a side hustle or whatever. Like I can't tell you how many times I've heard women say, I don't know what's wrong with me that I can't handle this, when they're describing situations that no one could handle. I mean, so it's especially for Black women, we have this strong Black woman schema, as it's called, and it emphasizes this hyper independence and, the ability to just take on whatever's thrown at us and not complain and not skip a beat, so to speak. So first looking at like, wow, I really am dealing with a lot here.
Yeah.
And no wonder that I'm feeling tired and run down. Okay, let me get back to basics. Before I go to my doctor, let's look at what it is that I'm doing that are, that have to do with diet and lifestyle. It's not going on some kind of restrictive plan as much as it is learning how to reconnect the body and the mind and listen to its signals and recognize when you're eating out of hunger and when you're eating because you need an escape, when you're eating because you need some kind of relief. Learning how to actually nourish the body from a hormonal perspective, which has to do with, first and foremost, balancing your blood sugar. When we talked earlier, I mentioned that I had just been through a very stressful move. Yeah. And there were certain days where my anxiety was very high, not because I was imagining scenarios, but because there was just a lot that was coming at me all at once. And I was very tempted to, reach for something sweet or something alcoholic. And I thought, okay, that's just going to add fuel to the fire. What do I actually need? I need foods that are going to ground me. I need things that are going to keep me stable. And a lot of us don't realize the relationship between our mood and how we are eating. If you want to have more energy throughout the day, then you need to focus on protein, fat, and fiber. If you want to feel irritable and foggy and all over the place, then keep reaching for the carbs and the sugar and the caffeine, and not to shame those things. because I don't eat a restrictive diet. I eat a little bit of everything. I don't really eat junk, but not because I can't, just because I don't like how it makes me feel.
Yeah.
And Annie and I stayed with each other in Australia a couple of years ago. So she's like, I know you.
Yeah, I
But
do know you. I do know you.
I'm not a maniac, but like I know how I like to feel and I eat accordingly.
If I
Yes,
can
go
just
ahead.
interject a little bit here and say, we are coming out of the pandemic. I feel still the impact of it
Yeah.
is still very much there. And now we're seeing the post effects, particularly when it comes to burnout. I have
Yeah.
had more conversations about burnout than I ever have in my work, seeing
Yeah.
colleagues experiencing that, clients talking about that within the
Yeah.
coaching and personal development community. There's a lot of that happening. I'm wondering, where do people need to go to get the information that they need? Because a lot of times there are people who are suffering in silence. There are people who just don't know where to go. And we begin to ramp up this conversation of burnout.
Yes.
And like, the foods that you're talking about, like instead of reaching for sweets and alcohol, what are the things that we
Yeah.
should be reaching out for? And just having that more of an education, because I feel not everybody has access to this kind of information. A lot of times people just suffer in silence. If somebody is listening to this and going like, I feel like you're describing me, I feel like you're talking about me, where can they begin? Because
Yeah.
I have great resources.
Yes. Well, you can read my book, Resilience. That actually is a good place to start. That's very accessible. Although I was commissioned to write that book. I was asked to write it by my publisher. So it's out of my hands now, but it is available in all over the world, and it gives you really practical steps for recognizing burnout and for things to apply in your specific situation. I also have the 5-step resilience blueprint, which is specifically for women of color in midlife, because a lot of us have been carrying these things for as long as we can remember. And when perimenopause starts, we really don't have an alternative but to look at what's really going on.
And just to clarify, to whoever is
Mm-hmm.
listening, and you're probably a white woman and you're going like, you're talking a lot about women of color, what about me? And I just want to bring it back to a conversation that I had with Enda Gilbert, who's part of the biker community, and she is a parental burnout practitioner, and she
Mm-hmm.
experienced burnout herself because as a migrant, which I know relate to Jolinda, you don't have that village. You do not have the
Yeah.
people who you would lean on for support. And so you're bringing up a family, you're bringing up this human, and everything is falling on you. You've got your career, you've got
Yeah.
your mothering duties, and every other responsibility that you're holding.
Yeah.
And it is inevitable. It is inevitable that you will reach that point where you will feel like it's a breaking point. And so
Yeah.
for women of color, why we are focusing on women of color is because of the different things that we have to carry, and how even culture and society views us as that strong Black woman, like there's so much
Yeah.
expectation that we're just to keep going and going and going. And a lot of times there's
Yeah.
a lot of things that we are fighting. We are fighting, racism, we're fighting capitalism, the patriarchy. There's a lot of systems in place that have been put to keep us at a certain level.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to wrestle with. So if you're somebody who's listening going like, why is
Yeah.
the focus so much on this? But I also want you to think
Yeah.
about it from the aspect of, if you are a space holder, this is such important information for you to know, so that if you do have women of color coming into your work, into your programs, your one-to-ones or whatever offers that
Yeah.
you have out there, those are things. This is such important information that you need to know, so that you can be a better space holder for them. Because if you don't have this information, you will treat them the same way you treat your other clients, which may
Yeah.
not apply. Is that not right?
Yeah. It is absolutely right. Yeah. And when you were talking about the systems of oppression, and so many of us also, as women of color, have to dismantle those systems of oppression within ourselves.
Yeah.
And there are so many things that we just, in my experience as well, like I just thought that's the way it was until I started questioning these things. But this is something else, when we're talking about stress, when you're in the stress response, you're not available for questioning. You're not available for exploration. You're not available for reflection. You're not interested in reconnecting the body and the mind, because the body is telling you things that the mind finds to be very inconvenient. One of the questions that I ask sometimes is, when was the first time you remember ignoring your body's signals? And for me, I was a teenager, because I I remember I was so obsessed with getting a certain grade in this honors AP history class, and I was really tired, but I thought, no, I have to keep working on this paper. I have to keep working on this paper, and I was 16.
Oh.
I think it's even worse now, to be honest, among young people, the pressure that they put themselves on. We have to be willing to tend to ourselves and be kind to ourselves and with each other, because that's the other thing. 40% of people in 100 countries worldwide are dealing with burnout, and burnt out people are not always kind people. And so we have to give people space.
Stressed people are not kind people. That is so true.
No.
That is
so it true. Is. A lot of us are at our limit. We're beyond capacity. We don't even realize how far away from baseline we've gone because we've been in it for so long. And so I like to every day extend compassion to myself and to others. And a lot of times, the more one of the things that I've noticed, especially as a result of coming through an incredibly stressful time these last few months, is the vulnerability that's involved in receiving help, in the vulnerability that's involved in saying, I am a beginner, at the vulnerability that's involved in saying, I actually do need a break. I actually can't take all of this on right now. When you are in the stress response, you're just looking for safety. You're not looking for vulnerability. So a lot of times, even though we desperately need help, we're not going to go out looking for help because it feels scary. A lot of us have suffered trauma as a result of going to the doctor, especially women of color, and racism is a huge thing in the medical field. So even though we are struggling and we are noticing these symptoms, we don't feel like ourselves, but we think, okay, I've got to keep on keeping on. That's what my dad always, he always says, I'm holding my own. And I think, okay, I'm glad that at 80, you're holding your own. But at the same time, how isolating does it feel to have to hold everything on your own?
We all know first impressions count. Yet, rather than putting their best foot forward, most big-hearted, well-intended coaches are unknowingly starting their relationships with their prospective Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color clients off on the wrong foot by making statements such as the following: No, 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 no. Where are you from originally? Wow, your English is so good for a Black person. Your skin tone is not dark enough. Are you sure you're from Africa? We have a scholarship program to support people just like you. These subtle yet gut-punching microaggressions can feel like death by 1,000 cuts for a person of color, as they are continually reminded they don't belong. That is why I've put together a training called Microaggressions 101, where I help you to understand how to hold safer spaces in your online coaching business that will see you serve a wider and more racially diverse audience. For instant access, head over to anigishuru.com/LT. That's anigishuru.com, gichuru.com/LT. The LT is for live training, and you can find this link in the show notes. You've mentioned we're lacking community, but where we do have access to support, I really want to talk about the kind of support that is available to us and the people that we're going to get this support from. When we think about the important roles that coaches play, such as pivotal role. I know the coaches that I have worked with who have left an impression and helped me get to where I am, be it from a business perspective or a personal perspective. For a white coach who is supporting a woman of color, what would you say from your own personal experience and profession? What would you say they need to do better or understand in order to create a more conducive environment for growth and for that person to experience the kind of, I guess, success that they want to experience?
Well, I think one of the things, I went through a training that's no longer offered through the Feminist Coaching Academy several years ago. And they talked about the importance of, if you have, let's say you're offering a group program and you have one person or woman of color in that group, chances are, even when they're used to being the only one, their stress response is going to be activated and their armor is going to be on. And it's going to feel like, okay, one situation where I have to have one more situation where I have to have my guard up, I have to prove myself. And so it can be really helpful just to, reach out personally and say, I noticed on the first call that you're the only participant who's a woman of color, and I just want to check in with you if how you felt during the call, if there's anything that you'd like to share with me, so that I can make your experience as comfortable as possible. I would say, if you, depending on how large your program is, going through some kind of training like the one that you offer, Annie, is baseline. But depending on how large your program is, looking at, okay, if I have the means, maybe I should welcome people of color onto my team, because I can't tell you how many white coaches I've gone through their programs and they use stock photos of people of color, but then their whole support team is white.
Speak on that.
And it makes you feel invisible, especially when you are a brilliant coach in your own right with a lot to offer, and you feel like you're being coached, so to speak, by people who aren't aware of the effects of racism and sexism and ableism, and who don't see things through an intersectional feminist lens, for example. It can be very frustrating. I can't do anything about and also, my mother's white, so this is not against white people at all, but I can't do anything about my race. Nobody can, but we're born the way that we're born. But we can do a lot about our blind spots. And if we know that we are missing information, we are missing training, we are missing relationships, we can always take steps to, as if you are a white coach, you can say, like, well, yeah, I really don't have any people of color in my network. Maybe I need to do something about that before I get to a point where it's like, oh my God, I need to talk to, because that's the other thing. It's like, we know when you're reaching out to us because you're desperate is to have someone who's not white. So it's about building these relationships in an organic way, and not because you feel like you've got to tick off a box.
And I
And
feel
I think that that's the other thing that's kind of happening in the coaching world. It's like, okay, well, I need to add a little bit of diversity to my, and when you have a summit with 40 people and you have 40 experts and not one of them is a woman of color,
yes,
come again.
yes.
It's stuff like that that I just can't. I have no tolerance for anymore. And the thing that on a very personal level, the thing that has really been hard for me over these last 7 years is when I've been I've been that one,
The
and I
one.
get the one, and I get the proof, with the promotional flyer,
Mhm.
and I say, I wasn't aware that I was the only person of color. Do you have plans to invite any more people of color, or is this the final, grouping? Because if so, I can't participate.
Mhm.
And so why is it that the woman of color, the single mother, I'm the one who has to say this is a problem? Because if I were a well-resourced white coach, if I were a well-resourced cis-figure coach, I would be raising my hand and saying, this is a problem.
100%.
But usually, more times than not, it's the people who are marginalized who have to raise their hand. And I think that's also, a big thing to remember is that even though someone is marginalized, it doesn't necessarily, we can't depend on the marginalized group to constantly ask for what they need.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
this is
if
where,
you're not part of the marginalized group, you can educate yourself and predict what they might need, and then engage in conversations to find out, is this something that would be supportive? You can also come to the table with ideas of your own and say, would this be supportive? Because sometimes we don't even realize.
no, we
It's
don't realize, but I think also privilege plays such a huge role when it comes to those who are well resourced, those who are putting
yes,
their summits together and bringing their friends or their networks in. A lot of the times when I have questioned and said, hey, what's happening? How come there aren't any women of color? Why is there one or two? In fact, I feel like it looks worse when there's one or two, because then it looks tokenistic, like, oh, we just had to
yes,
bring somebody in so that we looked like we were being inclusive. But then they
yes,
say, oh, they were seeking to be compensated. And this is a summit where we are not actually paying, it's free and everybody's coming free. But the people of color have actually requested to be paid, and we just don't have budget for that. And I always come back and say, if you actually had a relationship with them, if you
yes,
actually had connection with them beyond just inviting them for this, you never know what their response
yes,
might have been to your request to have them on the summit. It doesn't always have to be a monetary type of compensation, but if they're asking for compensation, it's because they probably do not know you, and they can sense
yeah,
the desperation in the fact that you need them right now. Also from an equity perspective, looking at the fact that, yes, I might have invited other people who are white and I'm not paying them, but I'm going to go a step further and I'm going to put a budget together for people of color. And this might be the amount that I can afford to pay them. And I want them to come in, and maybe it wouldn't be a free summit, maybe it will be a paid summit, so that I can compensate for those who have historically been excluded and left out.
yeah,
Those are the ways
yeah,
in which you begin to look at that lens of being more inclusive, and seeing how you can cater to bringing a little bit more of leveling the playing field, so that we're not
yes,
constantly marginalizing, even though we think that we are not, or going like, it's too hard, I can't,
yes,
I don't have the money, and it's left at that. And you just see 40 women
yes,
coming up and sharing, and it's the same 40 women, it's the same group of people who just keep on growing and expanding. Now, I just want
yeah,
to change gears here, and I promised the listeners that we would talk about burnout and microaggression, because this is what got
yes,
my attention. So please
yes.
talk to us about the relationship between burnout and microaggressions. I didn't even know there was a relationship there.
Interesting. I think the important thing to remember about microaggressions is, when people hear the word micro, they think, oh, it's because it's just like a small thing. But it's actually termed microaggression because they refer to interpersonal interactions as opposed to macroaggressions, which are more, a policy level. But I always think that, microaggressions have the capability of causing great harm because it's almost like death by 1,000 cuts.
It is.
And we know that they're linked to increased rates of depression, prolonged stress and trauma, high blood pressure, lower productivity. So they have actual consequences. Women, not women of color specifically, but just women in the workforce, 78% have experienced microaggressions, 78%. And those women who experience microaggressions are twice as likely to experience burnout because, these everyday slights, insults, put downs, invalidations, they put us in a state of hypervigilance. And a lot of times they are about things that either we take as normal, normal aspects about ourselves, or things that we cannot change. And to avoid the microaggressions, a lot of us have to deny our authentic selves or engage in what I call strategic acts of self-abandonment. And anytime we have to divorce ourselves from our authenticity, that automatically creates stress within the body.
Code
And
switching.
code switching, exactly, and so yes, burnout is basically chronic stress without recovery. And people who are experiencing microaggressions in their day-to-day, whether that be at work or on the street, or something that I've noticed after 15 years of living in Spain, I've experienced a lot of microaggressions, and it's not that they always. The thing about microaggressions is that they're not always done with the intention of harm. Typically, they're actually
Correct.
not done with that intention, but they create it. It's like this armor that you feel like you have to wear, and the questions about your hair or your accent or where you're from. And this is always a big question, the where are you from, where are you really from. I've had conversations where people say I really hate when someone asks me that. I've had other conversations where they say it doesn't bother me, depending on how the tone, what the tone is. Sometimes impossible to completely avoid microaggressions depending on your level of experience with a certain group. But what always is possible is to recognize when you have offended someone, to apologize if that is the case, and to commit to doing better next time, as in going off and educating yourself, and not putting the responsibility of education on the person that you've offended, because a lot of times that's well, tell me why that's wrong. There are a lot of ways that you can inform yourself without having that conversation with the person that you hurt.
And I feel like microaggressions is an area that there's a lot of misunderstanding. A lot of people actually don't understand what a microaggression is, what leads to it, how to address it, how to move forward from there, and especially as space holders, it's something that is really, really important in terms of having the knowledge of how to navigate microaggressions, or those that might happen in your group program between others, participants if you have your group program. But I want to bring it to the last question, almost the last question, Jolinda, because you're now a published author. Resilience, 10 Ways to Recover from Burnout and Exhaustion. What has writing a book done for you and to you on both
Mm.
the personal and professional? Because I know when we were together in Melbourne, you were saying, I'm writing
Yeah.
about Annie, I'm going to be a published author, and I'm
Yeah.
feeling it in my bones. How was that
Yeah.
experience for you?
Well, the funny thing is that a month later, this publishing house in London reached out to me and said, "We're looking for someone to write a book about burnout, and it's going to be called Resilience, and you have 6 weeks to get it done."
Whoa.
So that was at the end of 2022.
Yes.
And, it's like write a book about burnout without burning out. That's what, but because I had spent so many years writing things without actually sharing them anywhere, researching, and I keep, as you can see, I've got lots of books behind me.
You sure do.
But
It puts mine
I've
to
got
shame.
lots of well, there's actually a row behind each of these rows. There's a row behind that.
Oh,
So it's, I mean, I have many, many books, but I also have many notebooks. So
Yes.
when I sat down to write, a lot of times I was going through my old, notebooks, old reflections, and thinking, okay, what do I want to contribute? But the one thing that I wish that I had added to the book and was an additional chapter about community, which I mentioned briefly earlier. But at the time of writing the book, I still hadn't realized just how important it was for me to have that support, because that's something that is my ongoing lesson. I, as much as I help my clients to receive support, as in like that's one of their specific goals, I need to welcome in help, and I intellectually know how important it is. I often struggle with not doing it all on my own. And in this last, well, almost 2 years now, I wouldn't be where I am without other people's help. And being able to trust that other people really do want the best for me, and that we really are all connected, and we really are here to lift each other up. And so I've always been a giver, but it's been challenging for me to give other people the opportunity to give to me. And that's one of the things, if you're constantly giving, but not just giving, withholding. A lot of us, we give, and then when someone says, can I help you with that, we say, no, I don't need it.
That's right.
And we withhold the opportunity for them to help us, and that will put you on the fast track to burnout every time, because and it goes back to it relates to everything really that we've talked about, because you're not going to reach out for support. You're going to continue taking on everything yourself, and you're going to believe that it's a personal failing when you can't keep up, and when really you were never meant to do it all on your own. So yes, the book has been an interesting journey. It's also shown me that I want to write another book specifically about midlife resilience. So I'm going to start a Substack soon called Midlife Resilience, Embracing Change, Unleashing Potential. And it will specifically focus on the energy of midlife and the transformation that's taking place.
If fear
Yes.
was not a factor, how would you show up in your work?
Oh, if fear were not a factor, I would definitely reach out to people more than I do. That's always something that causes me a bit of, saying, hi, so and so, I really admire you, and notice that you've been struggling with symptoms of burnout. You've mentioned that, and I don't know if you're familiar with my work, but I would really like to support you. And that sounds so lovely when I say it, but when it's
Yeah,
time to actually do it,
I want you in my corner.
yeah, I often think like, okay, I'm bothering people. It's, and I know it's not true, but I when I'm working with clients, one of the things that I always do is help to liberate them from their impossible standards. And I, in these last few months, have had many things going on in my personal life that have really shook me to my core. And I need to start showing up again in the way that I used to. But also, it's really hard to show up when you are not feeling safe. Because it's like you are feeling, so many of us, as coaches in the online space, we feel this relentless pressure to constantly be on. But like when you're grieving, when you are going through divorce, when you are you find out that you unexpectedly have to move house and you don't know where you're going to live, and these things that really do shake you. And I'm not saying that all of those things were just happening. I have gone through divorce, I have grieved, and I have had bad housing situation, and that's not all at the same time, thank goodness. But it's really an impossible standard to think, okay, none of that matters. I'm feeling, less safe than ever before, more insecure than ever before, but I'm going to keep putting myself out there. And sometimes we have to pull back and say, like, my business is not going to run without me at the center. And I cannot hold space for people if I'm not holding space for myself. First and foremost, as coaches, we have to know how to hold space for ourselves. Yeah. And so, a big part of that is recognizing when we actually are at our limit. And that's not a failing, that's just reality, and so sometimes to build up that capacity again, we have to scale back, and I've been supporting my people in other ways, but to be honest, Annie, I haven't been doing the reels like I used to, and I haven't been on video like I used to, just because I've been in a bit of a retreat mode after years and years of constantly.
Yeah. And I think that is the beauty of seasons. That's why we have winter, autumn,
Yes.
spring, summer. There is a reason, because we cannot stay in winter forever. We cannot stay in summer forever. We cannot be in springtime where things are just blooming all of the time. Things have got to change. Yes. And I think there's been that expectation that in business, we have to always be switched on. We have to be, delivering those reels on a weekly basis, and we've got to just keep going and going. It is simply not sustainable. And I think it is so important that we honor the periods in our lives that we're going through. If it's a grieving season, if we're in winter, so to speak, that we go through that winter, and when we're happy to emerge, when we have supported ourselves and we have the resources within ourselves to then emerge and do what we need to do that, and that is okay. And those are conversations that don't often happen. We're not seeing or hearing people talking about that, and it's because maybe people don't know how to talk about that, Jolinda, or people want to keep that in, private and personal. But certainly when it comes to business, it's not linear. It is up and down. There are valleys, as we spoke about. And I think that's a conversation that's very much missing in the online space. And I'd really love to see that become more normalized. And I'm hoping that when you move seasons, that you can come back and we can talk about those seasons that are hardly ever spoken about. So where can people find out more about you, Jolinda, and if they want to get in touch?
Yes, my website, jolindajohnson.com. And I also have when you visit my website, a 5-minute stress relief routine that I highly recommend, because it's what I do when I feel like sometimes we just need a break. So instead of reaching for the candy in our desk drawer, or pouring that second glass of wine, like, you can actually take 5 minutes to breathe, to shake, to create some inner space. And that's what I have when you go on my website.
I am going to
Instagram.
I am going to link
Yes.
in the show notes, and your Instagram, of course, please tell us.
Yes, is also Coach Jolinda. My LinkedIn is Coach Jolinda. If you don't mind, Annie, before we finish, I just want to remind people that, burnout, even when you reach the final stage of burnout, which very well could be a chronic condition, like, that's the case for me. My ankylosing spondylitis is a result of my burnout 10 years ago, and it's something that I have to manage for the rest of my life. But even in those circumstances, burnout itself is also a season. And it's really easy, because of the way that stress works on the mind, to believe that how you feel when you're burnt out is just how you're always going to feel. And even when we, do take the time to slow down and to recover, that also can be really confronting, which is why it's important to have people around you, like, depending on what your goals are, or goals/needs are, coaches, therapists, who can remind you of who you truly are. Because it's really easy to over-identify with the part of you that has lost the brilliance. And that's not, it can come back, and it will come back. So if you are experiencing burnout and you're just feeling like, well, this is who I am now, I can promise you that it's who you might be right now or for now, but it's not who you are. It's not a permanent sentence.
Oh, what a beautiful way to end that. If you are experiencing any of the things that we've discussed here, please do reach out to Jolinda. The details are on the show notes. But quickly, if you're listening, if you're jogging, if you're driving, it's Coach Jolinda on Instagram or LinkedIn, and her website, jolindajohnson.com. Thank you ever so much for your time. It is an ungodly hour there where you're at. Thank you for bringing full self, your full, beautiful self. I appreciate your time so much.
Thank you, Anne.
I'm just grateful.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented.